Welcome to our talk, Graph Neural Networks for Geometric Graphs. This talk was delivered in person at the AI Research Group seminar series by myself, Chaitanya Joshi, and Simon Mathis. Both of us are PhD students at the Computer Laboratory of the University of Cambridge. This work is based on the paper on the expressive power of geometric graph neural networks, which is joint work with our brilliant collaborator and excellent scientists, Chris Bodnar, Taco Cohen from Qualcomm Research, and Pietro Leo, our supervisor at Cambridge. This work will be presented as an oral at the NeurIPS workshop on symmetry and geometry. Now, the first part of this talk, or the introduction, was not recorded, so I'm just doing this recording later and saying the same things. And very quickly, we'll move to the actual talk. This talk is about building neural networks for systems in science and engineering. Such systems are often modeled with geometry as well as structure. So we are interested in biochemical systems ranging from small molecules to proteins and nucleic acids, as well as systems in material science, such as crystals or catalysis systems, all the way to engineering systems for smart cities, such as transportation networks or multi-agent robotics and navigation, or even 3D computer vision and perception. All these systems can be united under this framework of geometric graphs.
Materials, and these applications also extend to things in transportation and logistics, robotics, and 3D perception as well. And in all these systems, you have some geometry and you have some structure. So you model that through graphs with geometry. And essentially, like our research focuses on biochemical systems. We're really interested in modeling structure, simulating dynamics, potentially designing new systems. This is the big dream of de novo design. And we're really interested in understanding the key tools for enabling these applications, which are these graph neural networks for geometric graphs. So this talk is more about the tools, the foundations, the theory of these models. Now, if you take nothing away from this talk, then here's a one-slide summary. There are two classes of GNNs for these graphs: invariant graph neural networks, which pass messages based on some local scalar quantities like distances, and equivariant graph neural networks, which transport local geometry via some vectors or geometric information. We study these models in terms of their expressive power in distinguishing geometric graphs, so telling things apart. And we're able to provably show or formalize that equivariant models are more powerful than invariant ones. Now, before we dive into the actual content, we can play a little game. So just to motivate this work, right? Like these are super interesting problems that people who've been modeling molecules have been studying for decades now. Problems such as this, the fact that, these are two different geometries, but they have the same unordered set of distances and angles. So if you just looked at the set of distances and angles, you couldn't tell them apart, even though they're clearly different. And this problem actually has big implications which are relevant to graph neural networks. So if you look at these two structures, then your GNN, usually updates the features of this central node using its neighbors. But if the features of all your neighbors are computed using distances and angles, then you may not be able to tell these neighborhoods apart. And this can manifest itself in your model not being able to predict properties about these substructures. And it extends beyond as well. So from local neighborhoods, GNNs usually stack these layers. So if you can't distinguish local neighborhoods, you can't distinguish entire graphs themselves. Because, for example, in this case, right, all the local neighborhoods have identical scalars, identical distances and angles. What actually distinguishes them is that, the geometric or directional information is different. So in our work, we're trying to build a formal framework to study such questions and use that to design new models in the future. And a bit hand wavy, we also want to study the so-called Picasso problem on graphs. So famously, if it's an image with nose, eyes, and mouth, it may not be a face unless they're oriented in a certain way, right? And Picasso used to draw these really interesting paintings, which Jeff Hinton used as an inspiration for some past work. So the agenda for today's talk, the first two parts kind of set the stage, give you some background and introduce these two classes of models, introduce the key ideas needed for the second two parts where we build this theoretical framework to study these classes of models. And I'll be flashing this any questions slide in the middle of sections. So we're happy to engage with your questions during the talk as well. So let's start with normal graphs. A graph is a set of nodes connected by edges, and each node usually has some feature or some attribute. These are scalar information. If you're a molecule, then you know what each atom is and how it's bonded to each other. So you have this graph structure, and graph neural networks essentially update these scalar features progressively over multiple layers. You update your node features, and then in this work, we consider the setting where you kind of pool all these features together to make some prediction for your entire graph. And this is like a very high-level overview of what GNNs do. Specifically, we focus on message passing GNNs. So this class of models gathers or updates node features based on borrowing information from your neighbors as features. So if you sit at the reference node in red, then you kind of collect messages or features from your neighbors, you pool them together into an aggregated message, and you use that aggregated local information to update your own features. And you do this progressively, so your neighbors are being updated by their neighbors, and you're progressively expanding where you get information from. Now, more formally, you have two steps to message passing, the aggregation and the update step. So the key part is really aggregation, where you are sitting at a node and you look at all its neighbors J. You build some sort of message, some function of your features and your neighbor's features. You may pass that through an MLP, and then you aggregate these messages. So you usually just sum them together. And it's important that the way you aggregate doesn't care about the ordering of your neighbors, because graphs don't come with ordering. And this is a really simple picture of just a two-step process. So you aggregate, which is the key step, and then you update. You take the stuff that you aggregated and you combine it with the stuff that you already know, and you update your features. So these were graph neural networks. What we're interested in is now how to generalize that to geometric graphs. So geometric graphs are graphs, nodes and edges, embedded in d-dimensional, or for all intents and purposes, 2D or 3D space. So now you not only have these scalar features, but you also have coordinates, which tell you the position in XYZ axis. We can, so molecules have atoms, and these atoms are usually located somewhere in space. We can make this even more interesting, and we can consider other geometric attributes attached to each node. So quite simply, for example, like each of your atoms could have a velocity or an acceleration or other geometric quantities. And these would also be in the same, let's say, 3D space, for example, as your coordinates. And without loss of generality, we work with a single geometric vector, but we could work with tensors, or we could work with multiple vector features as well. The framework, or our work is general, but for simplicity, we only consider single vector feature. What makes geometric graphs interesting is not just the fact that you have these features, but the symmetries that act on them. So molecules are embedded in space, right? So you could take your molecule or your geometric graph and you could spin it around, you could move it around in space. The properties of this graph will not change. However, the geometric attributes do change. They transform as you transform your graph. So if you were to rotate your graph, your coordinates and your vector features will rotate accordingly. Your scalars will remain unchanged. These are invariant quantities. But if you do anything to the geometry, then your geometric attributes will change along with it. Similarly, you could also translate all your nodes, and your coordinates would translate. Importantly, your vector features don't translate because these are always relative to your node. So there's like just one small distinction between coordinates and other general vector features. But that's the setup. We have these geometric graphs. These have 3 types of features, and what makes them super interesting is that you have symmetries acting on them. Now, we want to build graph neural networks for them, right? So we want to apply certain functions on these features, and we want to update these features. So we talked about how these scalars actually remain invariant or unchanged under rotations, right? So if we update these scalars within our graph neural network, which we normally do, we want to make sure that that update is invariant to rotations as well. So what this figure shows is that, if I rotate my input, if I rotate my graph, then in the output space, F is maybe my GNN layer. In the output space, they should map to the same point or the same output. At the same time, vector features, as we said, are rotating along with the graph, right? If you rotate your graph, then your vector features rotate equivalently. And we need to ensure this property in any GNN layer that builds vector features. So if you update the vector features of this orientation, or if you rotated it and updated its vector features, then in the output space, you should be able to apply an equivalent rotation. So it doesn't matter what path I take, whether I rotate first and then apply the GNN layer, or whether I apply the layer and then rotate the output, you should map to the same output point. And this property is called equivariance. So essentially, geometric GNNs are built using these 2 kinds of functions, these 2 kinds of layers. And we're really interested in what happens when you really stack these layers, when you build models which progressively propagate such information. Are there any questions so far? Just gonna remove this. Oops, sorry.
Hi, can you hear me?
Okay, great. So, oops. So, yeah, we want to talk about how we actually build these geometric GNNs, and we can start with the simplest class of models, which only update scalar information. So, for example, we can consider a model called Schnet, which uses only relative distances. And how it does it is that when you're building the message between yourself and your neighbor, you now condition it on the distance, the pairwise distance between you and your neighbor. And such an operation is invariant because no matter how you rotate or move your system around, you never change the distances. The distances always remain the same. So these are scalar quantities that remain invariant. Similarly, you could maybe start building messages among triplets and using angles. This could potentially be more powerful, and models do this. And this gives us a general kind of class of models which use some scalarization of the relative positions. So, you basically need to ensure that how you scalarize your geometric information is invariant. And that way, these models ensure that you map to the same output for different rotated versions of your input. Now, the other class of models are equivariant GNNs, and these models essentially don't scalarize. Instead, they pass geometric information as part of the architecture. They need to do a few more special things. And here's one very simple, straightforward example of such an architecture. It's called pane. So now you update both scalar quantities as well as vector quantities. And your scalars are updated in the same way as Schnet. It's, you just use the relative distance and you condition your update based on your neighbors. Interestingly, your vectors are now updated based on aggregating from your neighbors' vector features as well as your neighbors' relative positions. Yes.
There's a question online.
Yeah.
It's saying, I'm a bit puzzled by the use of the term equivariant, which in dynamical systems means that your vector field commutes with the symmetry group. I don't see the commutation in that.
Great question. I think maybe for the purposes of the talk, we haven't been as precise as we'd like to be, but you could imagine these vector features or generally tensor features as vector fields attached to each node in your graph, or tensor fields attached to each node in your graph. And then certain symmetry groups act on these fields, right? And then I think like your understanding is correct that, these features, these fields commute with the symmetry group. So they may rotate in an equivariant manner as you rotate your field. And you want to update these features within your model. Yeah, so equivariant GNNs essentially are now passing scalar and vector features. Yes.
What's the difference between the scalar features and the vector features in this case?
Yeah.
That scalar feature is just one more element in the vector.
Right. Great question. So the difference is that vector features have additional constraints on the symmetries that act on them. So scalar features are always invariant. So, you could rotate your graph, but you want to map scalar features to the same point for rotated versions of your input. For vector features, you need to obey the appropriate symmetry. So, you start with maybe velocities. Now you're learning to update these velocities or these vectors, but you can't disobey physics. Like these still need to be physical quantities, so they still need to live in d-dimensional space like 3D, and they still need to rotate as you rotate your overall system. And like this is an important caveat. So, you can't, and this means that you can't do all the usual fun deep learning stuff like applying ReLUs on your vector features, because nonlinearities would break this symmetry constraint. And essentially, well, maybe this slide says exactly that, your updated vector features. So you have some inputs and you pass them through a GNN layer, you get updated scalars and vectors. If you were to rotate your inputs, your scalars should remain invariant, unchanged, while your vectors should rotate correspondingly. So essentially, like your layer always needs to obey invariance and equivariance constraints of your model. Now, there are very promising empirical results for both these classes of models. So, invariant models are quite successful for proteins, for catalysts, like these larger systems. Equivariant GNNs are doing super well for molecular simulations. David is here in the audience. Thanks for coming in. Like, his work is one of the super cool works in this area. But key theoretical questions still remain unanswered. So what are the trade-offs between these two classes of models? And how do we really study the expressive power of these models? And this is what we want to work on, what we want to really study through our work. And I'll hand it over to Simon now.
Thank you. Chaitanya.
Do you want to take the mic?
Do you have the mic on you? Can I have that? Lovely. And maybe one question, I will be trying to point at slides. I'm not particularly tall. Is there a stick or so that I can use? If there is something that I can use, that'd be fantastic.
Nice.
Otherwise, I'll do my best. In the meantime, maybe I can say a word about the vector features as well. One thing that might help is using a slightly different terminology as well. Because very often in kind of GraphML, we talk about feature vectors. And what we really mean is a list of features. Because the vector usually, at least in mathematics, comes with a notion of how it transforms under certain symmetry operations. Fantastic, thank you. And so if we think of it as a feature list, the scalar feature list just doesn't change as we rotate. But the vector feature list actually does change.
And the sense that you're used to give it a mathematical sense, not just a...
Exactly. Exactly. And so the confusing terminology of calling it a feature vector, in a sense, we could even have a vector of vectors in that sense. And what we really mean is we have a list of vectors which transform under rotations in the way that we normally kind of have geometric vectors transform. Good. So much on the clarification. I will go with you into some of the work that we are presenting at the NeurEPS workshop for essentially how can we understand this kind of toolkit of models that Chaitanya has just presented. So there's a fantastic kind of plethora of geometric GNNs that have popped up. And one thing we might want to do is we want to understand which ones are good for which tasks. And one way that this is often done in machine learning is to look at the questions of universality and discrimination. And I want to present them as essentially two angles to look at this toolkit and tease apart, which ones are useful for what questions can a certain model maybe help me answer. And just to elaborate on the setting, so we're given a class of models which I'll call M, and we're given some general input data, which I'll call D. And then one very common question that I think many of you will be familiar with is the question on universality, which says if I have any function of a reasonable set of functions that I can build on this data set, can I find a model in my class of models that will get me to have the same output as that function, or at least arbitrarily close? And this is kind of the very famous result of the one hidden layer MLP. If you make it wide enough, you can universally approximate essentially any function that is somewhat well behaved, so continuous. And so universality is one lens, which is very commonly used to study models. There is, however, another lens, which is also used, and that's what we call the discrimination lens. And that kind of takes if universality takes a top-down approach, saying of all of the possible functions, can I get all of the possible functions? Discrimination in some sense takes a bottom-up approach. So it says, if you give me two data points, can I at least tell them apart? Can I say they are the same thing or not the same thing? In particular, in the geometric setting, are they the same thing up to rotations or translations or reflections or not? And there is actually a very nice paper which relates universality and discrimination and shows that they are actually very closely related in the sense that you can build something universally approximating with something discriminating. And there's a section in our work which is also on this. For the purpose of this talk, I will not go into this in more detail. I'll just say one word on why discrimination is an interesting way to look at things. And the reason is, if you have universality, you're either universal or you're not, in some sense. So it's somewhat of a binary task. Whereas discrimination, you can kind of more granularly look at which types of data points can you actually discriminate versus can you not. And this is one of the motivations of why we look at discrimination as a lens. And let's start about talking about discrimination in the general graph setting without thinking about the complications of geometry, and then add them on as we go. So, seems it's frozen. Oh, there we go. So discrimination has been a lens of study, which has been used a lot in general graph neural networks, and it's very closely connected to the graph isomorphism problem. What's the graph isomorphism problem? It's basically if I take two graphs and I draw them in slightly different ways, are they the same thing up to kind of moving around my nodes or not? And you can see an example of this. If we take this graph here, it looks in the way it's drawn very similarly to this other graph here, but it turns out if we actually trace, what are the identities of the nodes and what are the edges, they are actually two different things. However, if you take this graph, second graph and the third graph, it turns out they are actually the same thing if you trace with the eyes which nodes are connected to which other nodes. However, superficially, the way they are drawn is very similar, very different. And the question of graph isomorphism is essentially, can we tease apart which graphs are just presented to us in a different way? The way this is done in computers is, of course, you take an adjacency matrix and you commute rows and columns. But in the kind of the intuition of it is very much captured by these pictures. So are we just drawing something differently, or are we actually having a different object? And one algorithm which was used very much essentially to study this question is the so-called Weisfeiler-Leman algorithm, which I think is from the 70s. Is that correct? 60s, even earlier. So it's a very classical algorithm. Can I just have a show of hands? How many people are familiar? Depending on that, I'll go in more or less detail. Looks about half of them, maybe a bit more than half. So I'll just, rather than going through the equations, I'll maybe just do a quick kind of example of how does the Weisfeiler-Leman algorithm work. And then we can talk about how we can generate it to the geometric setting. So in the first step, what we do is essentially we just take the graph that we're given, or both of the graphs that we're given that we want to compare, and we just assign every node a color that you see here, gray. And in the next step, what we do is we want to update the colors. How do we do this? We look at every node. So take this top left node here and say, okay, I'm a gray node, and in my neighborhood, I've got two other gray nodes. What I'm not allowed to do is say in which order they come, because this relates to the permutation invariance that Chaitanya was mentioning earlier. There is no predefined ordering of which one's the first or second or third node in the graph. So I need to look at them as a set, more particularly as a multi-set. So I only want to care about how often do I find a gray node, how many gray nodes are in my neighborhood, rather than is the first node gray, is the second node gray. And so this double braces here just means a multi-set, so a set which cares about multiplicities. So in this first example here, I see two gray neighbors. So I say, okay, I'll color any node which has two gray neighbors green in the next graph. And then you see all of the ones that have two gray neighbors are colored green in the next step. And then to give you one which is slightly different, if we look at this node, we see it's got three neighbors. And because it's got three neighbors, we give it a different color, red in this case. And we continue this updating procedure until the histogram of colors, or the partitioning of the nodes, essentially does not change from one to the other. So you can see there's, while there are different nodes, the assignment of essentially how many of which colors we have over kind of the graph, the node partition doesn't change anymore. And at this point, the algorithm terminates. And if we now want to compare two structures, we take two structures and we compare, is the histogram of colors, so the types of colors that we see, do they match or not? If they do match, then we say the graphs are isomorphic, or we cannot decide. And if they don't match, we know for sure they cannot be isomorphic. Now, some of you might be puzzled because the histograms here are actually the same, but the graphs are not isomorphic. And that's one limitation of the Weisfeiler-Leman test. It is that essentially it can only tell you for, well, it has a limitation that it can, when it terminates, either tell you it's isomorphic or it cannot decide. So it's not full-fledged solution to the graph isomorphism problem, which is an NP hard problem. But it goes a certain way. And now you might ask me, why do we want to look at this kind of algorithm that doesn't fully solve the problem? Well, it turns out the way the algorithm proceeds is exactly the way in which message passing graph neural networks proceed. They look at their neighborhoods, they aggregate, and then they change essentially their internal state that we have at a node. And for that reason, there's been a lot of work looking at the graph isomorphism, the Weisfeiler-Leman test for graph isomorphism to understand the properties of graph neural networks. And it could be shown that essentially that GNNs are just as powerful as the Weisfeiler-Leman test. If there is no notion of where the nodes are, if we have a positional encoding, this is not true anymore, because then we essentially have some sort of ordering. Now, you might think in the geometric setting, we do have some sort of positional encoding because we do have the coordinates of the nodes. So why does that not just solve the problem of Weisfeiler-Leman? Why can we not do Weisfeiler-Leman with the coordinates? And this goes back to precisely what Chaitanya was explaining with the extra symmetries, is kind of strings attached that come with these geometric features, because they cannot transform arbitrarily. We cannot just do anything with them. They need to obey the transformations under the symmetry group, so that essentially, as one of the guests in the chat wrote, they commute with the operation of the symmetry group. And so the question that we were asking is, can we generalize this Weisfeiler-Leman procedure to the geometric setting, which includes the kind of strings attached version, and use it to study graph neural networks and some of these geometric graph neural networks? So that's kind of the question that we started with in the next section of the talk. Before that, I would just want to say that classical Weisfeiler-Leman has been a driver in normal GNNs, and this was kind of one of the motivations. And one of our collaborators, Chris Bodnar, has done a lot of work on the classical setting, in case you're interested in that. Yeah, this is just essentially just the strings attached that I wanted to say. So essentially, because you have these geometric transformations, you cannot just do anything with your positional encoding with your coordinates. You have to make sure that it obeys the symmetry transformations. Are there any questions at this point before we go into how we might now generalize with these strings attached? Okay, doesn't look like it's the case. In this case, let's proceed to the generalization to the kind of what we call geometric Weisfeiler-Leman test. And I want to start with an intuition, because I think if you understand the intuition, A, the equations will be simpler to parse, and B, the intuition is really all that is, the real value lies, I think, in the intuition rather than in the actual detailed procedure. So in Weisfeiler-Leman, we had this local node-centric procedure for updating the nodes. So let's think about what are these local neighborhoods and how do they differ in the geometric setting versus the non-geometric setting. And when we do that, we'll see that in the geometric setting, our local neighborhood is essentially a point cloud. So we've got some other nodes which are situated, maybe, you know, I'm one node sitting here, and then I've got another sitting to the top right of me in this case, and another sitting to the top left of me. And this point cloud is characterized by two types of information. The first type we call neighborhood type. To give you an example, if I'm the central node, my hand is my first neighbor, the other hand is the other neighbor. I want to know, am I a node that sits in the middle of, for example, this chain? And that will be the neighborhood type. And that wouldn't care whether I'm rotated. I would still be a node that sits in a chain. And that's why neighborhood type information we say is invariant. At the same time, there's another information that is encoded in the neighborhood, and that is which way am I oriented? So, you know, is my head in this case pointing upwards, or is it pointing to the side? So these are the two elements of information, the type of neighborhood that I'm in and the way I'm oriented in which you could essentially decompose the information that is given to you as your local neighborhood. So in a geometric Weisfeiler-Leman setting, we need to take care of both of these types of information. And one of the informations transforms invariantly, while the other transforms equivariantly. So we need to take care of these two types of information according to the symmetries with which they transform. So what is one of the easiest ways we could do that? Let me just briefly state this again, that this leads to two requirements, which I just said, but just skipped over the slide. The neighborhood type information I want to be leads to wanting to be injective over the orbits of the group. So whether I take the molecule and rotate it, the local neighborhood, the point cloud, and rotate it or not, shouldn't depend on which color I give it, because that's the neighborhood type information. And at the same time, we require that we preserve the geometric information, which we can add by essentially auxiliary geometric variables. These are the two requirements for dealing with these type of information. And what are some kind of possible, very simple ways to deal with them? Well, for the second one, for the auxiliary geometric information, the conceivably simplest option conceptually is if we just copy paste all of the information. So if we can, find a way to copy paste the orientation information from one step to the next, and we propagate that, we have a lossless communication channel in a sense, which allows us to keep track of how things are oriented. And for the orbit injectivity of colors, we essentially just say that we assume that we have a invariant hash function for the moment, as we had in the Weisfeiler-Leman case. And I'll say a little bit about kind of constructing these invariant hash functions in practice at the end of the presentation. So this is the intuition. We have these two types of information. We deal with them differently. How does this translate in this kind of conceptually simple setting to geometric Weisfeiler-Leman? Let's start with the initialization. Oops. And we start in the same, initializing in the exact same way as we do in normal Weisfeiler-Leman. So essentially, we cover each node by just a hash of its scalar values, because we have a list of scalar features. Let's just color it by an injective. With hash, we just mean an injective function. I know kind of the computational implementation of a hash is not strictly speaking injective. For the purposes of this implementation, we mean an injective function. So we color every node by essentially the type of information it's given. For example, in the molecular case, might be a carbon atom, make all of them gray, might be a hydrogen atom, make all of them red. And as auxiliary geometric information, let's just add where this point is located. And the coordinate, if we subtract the center of mass, is actually equivariant under rotations. As a next step, let's aggregate the information. And this is what I meant with copy paste. And it turns out one simple way to actually do this aggregation is to create these nested sets of auxiliary geometric informations, where we just keep essentially, which we update by saying, what is my geometric information at iteration t? Well, it's whichever type of node I am, or whichever type of neighborhood I was seeing at iteration t-1. So maybe, for example, I was, this free line neighborhood at this point in time, and I was oriented this way. So the GI, the previous location, the previous iteration was just saying, was I rotated this way? Was I rotated that way? So essentially, which neighborhood was I before? How was I rotated? And which other neighborhoods are around me? Are they 4-star neighborhoods? Are they 3-star neighborhoods? And which way are they oriented? So how many of these other types of neighborhoods around me? How are they oriented? What do I look like? How am I oriented? This is the auxiliary geometric information that we update. And it turns out that if you do this, which essentially amounts to a copy-paste formulation, this gives you the kind of injective and G-equivariant properties that you would like to pass it on. And you can see this kind of drawn visually, that at one iteration, my receptive field is kind of this far, and I can see I've got a node here and I've got a node here, and they're positioned left and right. Whereas here I've got a slightly larger receptive field in the next iteration, and I know I've got, for example, this bend, this elbow bend, and another elbow bend, and they're oriented in slightly different ways, which is captured by the geometric information. So now we've passed on the geometric information essentially like a copy paste, So fairly simple in that sense. The next thing is, how do we actually update our node coloring? And this is where this iHash function comes into play. What we want to say here is we don't want to care which way exactly I'm oriented. I just want to say, if I'm oriented this way, and I've got another node over here, which is an elbow, that shape, and another node here, which is an elbow, the other shape, the other way around, compared to where I am at the moment, then I want to give me a new color. But if I were to rotate everything, that wouldn't change my color, which means it's invariant to the essentially overall rotation. It is, however, relevant what the relative orientations are of your neighbors, which you get through the geometric auxiliary variable. Thank you. Thank you. So this is the update. And we terminate in the same way as the Weisfeiler-Leman test, essentially, when the partition of nodes doesn't change anymore. And let's just go through one quick example. As I've been told that we've got 10 minutes, I'll speed up a little bit. So at iteration 0, we just color all of the nodes with scalar properties. And then we say, this node here has 2 neighbors, so it's a kind of 3 in a line neighborhood. Let's give it a new color. This one here also, 3 in a line neighborhood, gets the same color, which is blue for is 3 in a line. This node here has this elbow shape in a sense, so it has 2 neighbors again, which are at slightly different relative positions. Let's give it a yellow color. And now comes an interesting point. If we look at this one, it also has 2 neighbors, and it also gets the same yellow color because it's invariant to which way its neighbors are oriented. So if we cut out this part and cut out this part, you can rotate them on top of each other and you'll see they'll overlap, which is why they get the same coloring. And you proceed in the same way by looking now, I've got a blue node and red node oriented in this way with the neighbors attached, and you get the following coloring here. And you'll see that after these 2 steps, the color of the central node is actually a different one in these 2 examples. And this is how essentially GWL can tell these 2 graphs apart. So you'll see that ultimately the histogram of colors changes because at the second step, this node will know that I've got an elbow neighbor and another elbow neighbor, which are both oriented in different ways to each other than they are in this case. So this is the termination. And as a contrast, to study what this type of GWL allows us now to say about GNNs, I'm just going to quickly put a little strawman up in a sense, which is an invariant GWL version, which just gets rid of the auxiliary geometric information and just drops all of the orientation information. So it does exactly the same thing as GWL, just doesn't update the auxiliary information. So what can they and can they not distinguish? And we look at these 2 graphs again, and these 2 examples. And to introduce which graphs can be distinguished, let's just make 2 short definitions, one which we call k-hop distinct and one which we call k-hop identical. When are 2 graphs k-hop distinct? Simply when there exists a k-hop neighborhood within the 2 graphs, such that at least one of them is different. When are 2 graphs k-hop identical? If there doesn't exist any neighborhood, any k-hop neighborhood around any node, which is different from any other k-hop neighborhood in the graph. So I think fairly intuitive notions. And you can see 2 examples of this neighborhoods. This graphs are 1-hop identical because there is no 1-hop neighborhood which looks different from any of the other graph, but they are 2-hop distinct. And if we have these definitions, then you will be able to convince yourself fairly simply that GWL can distinguish any k-hop distinct geometric graphs after exactly k iterations. And we've gone through this example. So I'll not go through it again. I'll just compare this or contrast this to the invariant version of GWL, in which case it turns out that after any number of iterations, IGWL cannot distinguish any graphs which are 1-hop identical, essentially. And this has a very nice and simple interpretation, which just means that GWL is strictly more powerful than IGWL, as we would have expected, because we're passing on the orientation information. And as a short aside to it, it also kind of tells us when does the invariant information in principle at least capture all that we need. It is exactly when two graphs do not differ in their one-hop neighborhood. And when do they, for example, never differ? Well, if we connect everything to everything, then all of the one-hop neighborhood is the entire graph. And so we can always distinguish the entire graph. And this kind of empirically gives us a way of also saying why, for example, some of these graph transformers might be so powerful. Back to how we can use GWL now to understand, circle back to GNNs and what they can tell us about GNNs, because this was somewhat of an excursion into an abstract mathematical tool. How can we use this now to study the GNNs that we care about? Well, because GWL relies on these two abstractions, these two idealizations, essentially, one which is the copy-paste pass on of the orientation information. The other is this idealized I-hash, which allows us to characterize any local atomic neighborhood. It's fairly simple to prove that GNNs can never be more powerful, essentially, than GWL, unless you break the message passing paradigm in which this operates. And so, as a result, GWL is essentially an upper bound, and all of the limitations that essentially hold for GWL hold for the GNNs as well, that rely on this message passing paradigm. And maybe because we're running short on time, I'll just quickly proceed to the outlook and hand over back to you. So we've seen that these tests are proxies which allow us to study some of the properties of the GNNs. Just to say where's interesting further research, I think. So we were talking about this nested copy-paste procedure. There's also an unnested version, which we have an example of in the submitted version of the paper, which is a bit conceptually harder. It follows the same idea, but you can essentially, it turns out you can unnest this, and I'm happy to talk about this a bit more after. One thing in which GWL differs from GNNs is that this copy-paste is not directly implemented in GNNs, but instead we add vectors to this latent feature space, which in some sense corresponds to a noisy communication channel. And you can get these kind of broken telephone whisper chain phenomena where maybe adding some vectors, if we add lots of information over long distances, lead to a drowning out of information. And how, to which extent this happens is an interesting question that has not been thoroughly addressed in geometric graph networks. Another is, and we've got lots of interesting research going on in this university on this actually, how do we find a great representation of a local neighborhood? And there's fantastic work in the engineering department in Gaborziani's group with David, who's here in the audience, and Ilyas Batatia, on characterizing very well essentially the local neighborhoods and passing them on with invariant information, which takes a stab at finding an actually implementable version of this I-hash function, which in the unnested version is not a continuous function that we present, but does need to be a continuous function for some of the molecular dynamics that they need it for. And so these are exciting avenues for further investigation that we and others pursue, and I'll give to you for the kind of conclusion.
Well, yeah, this was the talk on graph networks for geometric graphs. And as we said, like, this talk is really about the theoretical foundations of these models and understanding our tools really deeply. In future work, we're excited to also apply them to biochemical systems or to material science, maybe hopefully discover novel therapeutics or more sustainable materials. And these are our contacts as well. We're very happy to talk more about this work with anybody. So that's it. If there are any questions, feel free to ask. Yeah. There's a lot more in the upcoming paper. There's a full theoretical framework and more general settings than, I think you also got bored of the same example that we showed. And practical implications, as well as what Simon alluded to, connections to universal approximation. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
we have time for a couple of questions. Nicola.
First of all, great job both of you. I have a bit of a question or explanation and something about. Can you elaborate more on the neighborhood types that you use? Is it like a finite set of, let's say, type because it seems that it might be one of the limitations of why the invariant geometric GNN test fails, right? The lack of expressiveness of the neighborhood type.
Do you want to answer that?
Yeah. So you're right, Nicola. It actually relies on having a finite set of possible neighborhoods, at least in the GWL case. If you have infinite memory, in principle, you can build it up. If you have any two graphs, you can say every new neighborhood that I observe, I enter into my hash table through the iHash, and I give it the next color. So I color it, for example, the first neighborhood I observe, and it doesn't matter which ordering you go through, actually. The first neighborhood I observe, I color with natural number 0. The second neighborhood I observe, I color with natural number 1. If I ever observe it in different orientation again, I'll also again observe it in number 1, which means you need to do a heck of a lot of lookup table reviews, which is why this particular implementation of GWL is more of a conceptually useful tool rather than something which is very useful in implementation. So in implementation, actually, what the people in kind of the geometric GNN community do is they often take essentially higher order tensors of the local environment, and they project them down to scalar versions to kind of summarize what the environment looks like.
But then it means that even the invariant version would still work for one hop neighborhoods, right? You can distinguish one hop neighborhoods if you have, let's say, more expressive.
Yeah, and if your full graph is a one-hop neighborhood, like in a transformer, then invariance is all you need.
Instead of like comparing the fully connected version, then
Yeah. Thank you. No, thank you for the question, and it's good to clarify. Yeah, this is a conceptual tool rather than, and it is possible to implement it. Actually, it is not very efficient, and unfortunately, because of the coloring and mapping to natural numbers, it is also not continuous, or it's continuous in the trivial sense of the topology of the natural numbers, which is not very interesting.
Well, I can say that so the WI is very inconclusive, right? That you can't say that, so you can only tell you that you are not the same, but you can't say the other thing. But then if we embed the graph, say in 3D space, and we take a fully connected one, then this invariant test is conclusive. So I can have a hash function that is always going to conclusively tell me the other thing. Now, if I introduce cutoffs, so I don't have a fully connected graph, then the invariant is again not fully conclusive. And you say with cutoff, the equivariant GWL is conclusive one.
Great question. I think it's I think it goes back to WL in the sense that when the test identifies two graphs as non-isomorphic, then they are non-isomorphic. But if the test doesn't identify as them as non-isomorphic, it's not necessarily the case that they're isomorphic. So they could be failure cases of the equivariant one. I think we don't have them yet, let's say, but we have failure cases of weaker versions of the equivariant test. Do you want to add something?
Yeah, I'd love to add something. So it's not something we've conclusively investigated, but my hunch about it is the following. If you take a geometric graph, there's essentially the two types of informations that you want to tease apart, which is geometric isomorphism and how is it topologically connected? So I could take the same point cloud, draw different edges, or I could take the same edges and distort the nodes, essentially. Because you have the positional encoding, so you take a graph with, say, 20 nodes, you draw any connectivity pattern that you like, and now you just move them around in space, you know, where they are. You take one node, so let's change you change the 3D geometry, exactly. You don't change topology, so which nodes are connected to which. You distort the nodes, coordinates, I should say, not distort the nodes. So you distort how it looks like in 3D. Because you can distinguish how things look differently in 3D, you can distinguish essentially this distortion on the nodes. And because you have a positional embedding, you can actually distinguish the different connectivity structures, because the nodes will carry as their local kind of embedding something which relates to where they are in space. And so because of that, you kind of alleviate that problem of WL, which has no kind of positional encoding. So my strong hunch is it is possible, but I would actually have to write it down to go search.
Okay, I'm going to finish because there's a lecture coming up to us. Let's thank Chaitanya and Simon very much.
Yeah, happy to.